It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
New technology and new practices have allowed maple sugaring to grow substantially and stave off fears of a maple-pocalypse because of climate change. Vermont produces about 3 million gallons of syrup a year, more than half the syrup produced in the entire country. Compared to 20 years ago, sugar makers are getting twice as much per tap and using less energy through new technologies like vacuum tubing and reverse osmosis. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, I spoke with Steve Palmer of Shelburne Sugar Works, a 170-acre maple farm that produces between 1,200 and 1,500 gallons of maple syrup each year, along with maple candy and assorted ice creams made from maple sugar, not cane. It's not your grandmother's maple sugaring operation anymore, Steve says. The metal bucket taps are long gone, and firewood as a boiling source is a thing of the past. Still, deep down, and as this year's session winds down, Steve says turning 40 gallons of sap into 1-gallon jug of maple syrup remains a labor of love. First this. Change is happening at Red Hen Baking Company. Later this year, Red Hen will be moving to a new location in Middlesex, and in the meantime, they'll be opening a new cafe in Montpelier, something customers have long requested. The quality, of course, will remain the same, with only the best of the best ingredients used in their breads, pastries, soups, and sandwiches. Owners Randy George and Eliza Kane are excited about all the changes, and know you will be too. Let's start with a little bit of history here. We're surrounded by gallons and gallons of maple syrup. Tell me about your grandmother.
So my grandmother Marjorie started sugaring in 1942 during the middle of World War II when there was a sugar shortage during the war. There was sugar rationing, actually, so you got a ration ticket for a certain number of pounds of sugar. My grandparents owned 2 farms here, and she said, hey, I can learn to make maple syrup, right? And we can supplement our the cane sugar with maple. And they would make everything into granulated maple sugar back then, which looks just like brown sugar. It's pure maple. And you can use it as a replacement for cane sugar or anything. She bartered with it. So she began, if you needed some firewood or something done on your house, she'd barter with sugar. And it was a great way to get started, and she absolutely fell in love with sugaring.
How much did she make?
She told me the first year they only had 50 taps. And she said it was the darkest syrup she's ever seen in her life, but she said she thought it was the greatest thing ever. And it kind of grew from there. And I think most sugar makers start out that way, right? They start out with a very small backyard operation, and before you know it, there's, you've got $3 million invested, and your wife's getting ready to divorce you, and you got a giant truck in your front yard, and you're having a ball.
When did you take over?
My uncle died in 2011, I believe, and I had always worked in the sugarwood since I was a little kid, right? I fell in love with it as well. It's one of those things that's in your blood once you start doing it. And I was in here canning syrup for my grandmother when I was 5. So I probably took the most interest of the 6 grandkids, and everybody still comes and helps out here today. So it was kind of a natural thing for me to kind of just take over what was already here. I was spending a lot of time in the summers and falls and spring, obviously, in the woods. So it was just kind of a natural transition for me.
Would you say it's more of a business or a passion?
I'd say it's a combination of the two, right? And I don't think anybody who is a bad business person can be a sugar maker at any scale at this point in time, right? It's kind of like a dairy farmer. It's an awful lot of work, and you have to really love it, number one, and you have to be a pretty good business person, and I would say at this point, pretty good with technology as well.
I mean, why did you continue? Why did you not want to do something else?
I do something else, but this is truly my passion, the things that I enjoy. Again, it was in my blood, and I just kind of said I've done this all my life, and I'm one of those people that wakes up at 2 a.m. and say, okay, I just figured out a way to improve vacuum or add 100 more taps over on this side, or some other thing that improves the operation overall.
What else do you do?
I'm a civil engineer by trade, so I have my own civil engineering company.
3 million gallons a year come out of Vermont, half of the country's production. First of all, how do you explain that?
Vermont is truly unique in that it's set up with a tremendous amount of maple, right? We also have mountains, which really help us in terms of modern tubing systems, gravity, which isn't absolutely the only consideration in this, but it's a huge consideration. We have more, I think, hard maple here in Vermont than many other places, which in the old days, right, you wouldn't tap a soft maple tree just because the sugar content was so low, like a soft maple or a silver maple. That's changed a little bit today with technology, but we've got 90+% hard maple here in Vermont, so it's conducive to sugaring.
Who's this guy next to us here?
So this is my brother-in-law, Matt Fisher. Matt's he married into the family here about, I don't know, has it been 15 years? 20 years?
Yeah, 20 years.
So Matt has been, I wouldn't even say helping out here. I would say it's much more than that. Matt's an integral part of this whole operation. He does all of the boiling today. I think Matt kind of fell in love with this as well. He and I and another friend of ours, Tom, work at this, pretty much year-round. It's not just in the springtime. So it takes an awful lot of people and help. It takes a village, really, to do this. So
I was an anesthesiologist at UVM for 35 years, but I've retired a couple of years ago. So the rest of the year, I do fun things like sail and mountain bike and just enjoy the great state we live in. I grew up in Franklin County, which is my experience with sugaring is I grew up in Franklin County, which is kind of the center of the universe for maple sugar or maple syrup production. So I was exposed to it as a kid, but I really didn't get into it until I married into this family and was conscripted.
Why is Franklin County the central?
If you think of, sugar makers look at number of taps in a certain area. That's sort of how you look at it. There's probably the most large production facilities up there in per county. That's why.
Steve, so how many gallons a year do you produce here?
It depends a lot on the year, right? So I try to look at it as gallons per tap. And, at a bare minimum, everybody always wants to make at least a third of a gallon per tap, hopefully a half a gallon a tap. And it's very much Mother Nature dependent. So if you do a really good job in the woods and a really good job with your vacuum systems and a really good job, setting things up so it's efficient, hopefully everybody's getting up toward a half a gallon a tap. This year started awfully late. We're normally boiling somewhere in the middle of February. And we didn't boil this year until I think the 10th or so of March. So, we would normally, I say normally, if there's any such thing as a standard year, but we would normally produce 20 or 25% of our syrup in February. We didn't get that opportunity just because it was so cold this year. So we kind of started behind a little bit, and I think everybody did. The upper elevations this year are a little behind. I was just up in Starksboro yesterday talking to some friends of mine who are boiling. The upper elevations are less than 50% so far for the year. We're at about 70 to 75% right now. So we'll see how the next week or so pans out. The weather right now looks conducive to it, but beyond 7 days, it doesn't look like we're going to get a freeze again. So we'll see. It may be a down year for the whole industry. We'll see in a couple of weeks. So,
Matt, what are you hearing?
Again, late start. Some unusual weather patterns. A 70-degree day is kind of unusual for us, and you would think that, that would be a great sap run, and it really kind of wasn't. It stays warm at night when it's 70 degrees during the day, and you don't get the freeze-thaw cycle that you need, which is actually the engine that creates the pressure that moves the sap out of the tree.
Let's talk about technology. There have been a lot of concerns. The term Maple-pocalypse has been thrown around. Everybody concerned about, or the UVM folks that really study this, concerned about global warming, climate change really affecting the industry. What has it?
There definitely has been climate change locally for sure. When I was a kid, we never used to start tapping until town meeting day, which is the first week of March. So, things have, in general, and this year is not a good indication of where we've been over the last 10 years. It's been very cold this year, but traditionally over the last 10 years, it's gotten much warmer. And we've started sugaring. The window for when we sugar has shifted, right? It's shifted about an entire month. So we used to start in early March. Now we start normally in early February. Some of that's technology related too, right? When we used to use just buckets, it's open to the atmosphere, it's open to the air, and those tap holes would dry out pretty quickly. You'd have about 4, maybe 5 weeks at the most before they would dry out. Now with modern tubing technology, that doesn't happen, right? You've probably got 8 weeks or more in there, depending on the weather a little bit. But that's opened up that window a little bit and allowed us to start a little earlier too. But certainly the weather patterns that are conducive to maple have been starting much earlier. I think last year we started sugaring early February, right? So like I said, if you looked at it on a 10-year window, we probably make 20 or 25% of our production now in February, but it also helps us work out all of the bugs so that when we get to the meat of the season, let's say in early March, mid-March, we've hopefully got all of the bugs worked out. You know, it's kind of a little bit like taking an old car and putting it in the garage and thinking you're just going to jump in after a year and turn the key and everything's going to be great. It never works that way. It sits there for, 10, 11 months, and there's always things that don't work. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot. So I like to get all of that worked out as early as we can, and then by the time the heart of the season comes, hopefully we're off and running and things don't break down.
What would you say to that, Matt?
In Vermont, at least, or the Northeast, we've been a little more insulated maybe from the effects of global warming. Producers in Ohio and mid-Atlantic states, things like that, have probably seen more of an effect, the very short seasons or what have you. And we all know about it, but there's always something in the wings. There's the horn beetle. There's something else that's always going to be a detriment to or be very detrimental to maple production. And, we just do the best we can. We get through, and the weather is the weather. As a sugar maker, you live that mantra, you can't control it. So we get out and do the best we can, and we've seen production that has been as good or not better over the last few years than we've ever had.
And is that because of the technology?
In large part, yeah. The technology is sort of key. The technology it's two-pronged. A, it makes it possible for 2 or 3 middle-aged and older people to work in the woods and do this, but B, it's amazing at how much in terms of sap procurement and how efficient the production can be. 2 of us couldn't do this without, for example, reverse osmosis. It would take 10 hours to boil our full sap tank of raw sap with our evaporator. Now, if you're coming here at 7 o'clock after work, that's a long day, and then you have to go to work the next day and do it all over again. With the RO, we can take water out of that main sap tank, 75% of the water, condense it down, and only have to boil for 3 or 4 hours.
Which of you is middle-aged and which of you is older?
I would say we're both older.
How much have you invested in the technology?
Oh, we jumped in with both feet in terms of technology, right? Every year they're coming out with more and more and more technology, and staying up with it sometimes is the hard part, right? Almost like any industry. But I think if you're not using technology, you're going to be nowhere near in terms of production what somebody else is in a competitive industry, right? So you need to be able to produce the absolute maximum amount of syrup per tap that you can, and you can't do that without technology today, and it keeps getting better and better. I tell people that come in all the time, like, we can run and monitor the great majority of the operation now today from my iPhone, right? It's amazing what you have at your fingertips for information. It not only helps you become more efficient in terms of a sugar maker, but it helps you produce a ton more. In terms of, we produce 5 times the amount of sap today that we produced on an old-fashioned bucket operation, right? And that gets better and better and better every single year.
Wow, that I didn't realize it was that significant.
It's huge. Yeah, it's unbelievable. And the technology on the opposite end of that, as Matt was talking about, the processing technology has really helped a tremendous amount as well. It's not that you have any less hours during sugaring season, but you're able to invest your time in the things that really matter in terms of production, instead of spending hours and hours and hours spinning your wheels on things like, for instance, vacuum leaks in the woods. Today I can look at my iPhone and say, I know exactly where to go and where the problem is, and I'm there in 10 minutes and I have it fixed, rather than walking through 25 miles of lines and trying to figure out where the problem might be and spending 3 days at it.
How can you tell on your iPhone where the leak is?
So we've got vacuum sensors all over the woods now, bringing up on a big screen here so folks that come into the sugar house can see things. But I can look at that and I can tell, and they're super sensitive, and I can tell you to the 1/10 of an inch of vacuum exactly where I have low areas or, problems. Or it might be 3 in the morning and a squirrel chews a hole or a limb comes down or we have an ice storm or windstorm or whatever the case may be, and I'll get an alert on my phone and it'll say, you've got a vacuum sensor that's low. And I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, it's vacuum sensor number 13, and I know exactly where to go.
Do you have to replace the tubing every year?
We replace all of the taps, all of the spouts, and all of the drop lines, which go from the tap to what we call the lateral line, which is a small line that runs through groups of trees to a larger main line. So we replace drops and spouts every year. We also replace a number of lateral lines every year. Basically, they become damaged or whatever. Main lines can last 10 to 15 years. But again, we replace them as they age. Things happen, they break, they become wavy or deformed, and having straight tubing is key.
Is there any loss of quality compared to the old bucket days?
Well, quality, I guess I would say people's perception of quality probably has changed a lot, Mark, right? It's different. And when I was a kid, everybody preferred, generally speaking, fancy, right, which is very light. Now we call it golden delicate. Very light syrup. It was very difficult to produce years ago. And dark was you could make dark all day long. It was easy with a bucket system. Today it's flipped on its head, right? So people come in, I would say locally now 80% of our people who are used to real maple, which is most folks that live here in Vermont, prefer a dark syrup, right? They want that stronger, heavier maple flavor. And most of our light syrup goes out of state. So it's kind of interesting. It's flipped on its head. Quality, I would say, is a matter of perception, right? You might like light roast coffee. I might like dark roast. Might like medium roast, right? Syrup's very much the same way. It's all personal taste. So, technology has certainly helped us in terms of quality of filtration, yes. Our ability to process sap very, very quickly. Huge amounts of sap very quickly. We could never do that kind of thing in the old days, right? It would sit in the tank for 3 days because we didn't have enough hours in the day to be able to boil it. Now we can process almost unlimited amounts of sap every single day. It doesn't matter how much is coming in. When we get to the end of the day, the tanks are empty, everything gets cleaned. We couldn't do that in the old days, right? So I guess in terms of some sort of quality question, it's certainly the technology has improved things. Our filtration's much, much better. Both sap filtration and also our syrup filtration. We used to take our syrup or finished syrup and run it through essentially cheesecloth. Today we have a much more modern filtration system, which the clarity of the syrup when it comes out of the other end, the majority of our stuff gets sold in glass today, is unbelievable. You can't see anything, and that's just pure, super clear. You couldn't sell it in glass, and it would look like honey if you just ran it through an old-fashioned cheesecloth system, which is great for your maybe refrigerator at home, but you wouldn't want to sell it to the public that way. They'd look at it and say, hey, it looks like something's wrong with this. So yes, technology certainly improved things, I think, a lot in terms of quality.
We romanticize the past. I mean, do you notice any difference between now and when you were 5 or 6 years old?
I certainly notice a difference in grading, right? So we produce today a lot of light and I call amber rich, right? Syrup, light and medium syrup, think of it in terms of color, right? It's really light, medium, dark, and extra dark, if you will. We produce a lot of light and medium syrups today. When I was a kid, we used to produce a lot of darks because it would sit in that tank for days at a time before we could ever get to it. And there was a lot of oxygen in that system too, right? All the spouts were open to the air. Today, we bring everything down under heavy vacuum. And we've gone from about, say, 2% dissolved oxygen in an old-fashioned system today down to less than 0.5% dissolved oxygen, which it makes a difference in terms of the bacteria, right? This is sugar water, so the bacteria is trying to attack that sugar water all the time. So the more oxygen you have, they need oxygen, they need food, which is the sugar, and they need temperature, those three things. So if you take any one of those away, the bacteria really can't attack those sugars, and that's what's making those darker syrups, right? People say, oh, you must be doing something different in your system, right? How do you produce the darks differently than the lights? You're not. It's really more temperature and time of year than anything else, right? So as we move along in the season, we typically produce darks as we get into late March and early April, just because the weather's warming up. We went the other day, for instance, we had a 75-degree day, And we went from a really light syrup the day before to dark robust overnight. So, and it was simply about temperature. And, we had thousands of gallons of sap that came in overnight and sat in the tank overnight. So it was 60 degrees in that back room. And, it was like a light switch. I came in and Matt was boiling, and I go, "What are you making? Are you making light again?" He looks at me and he goes, "No, this is pretty dark." So interesting how that happens. But we're working on technology to be able to control that as well. So we're moving toward a refrigeration system here. All of our concentrated sap by next year at this time will go into a refrigerated tank, like a bulk tank, like you'd see on a dairy farm. And we're going to hold that at 35 degrees. So hopefully we don't have that problem, and I wouldn't even call it a problem, but we have the ability to control that a lot more than we do today.
As a former are you still an anesthesiologist? Retired. Okay. I'm going to give you this question because maybe you could help me understand, and again, speak to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Reverse osmosis. How does that work, and why is it important in this industry?
So, in simplest terms, it removes water from sap. Traditionally, the only way you could do that was by boiling it with some sort of fuel, wood, oil, fossil fuel, and a lot of time. So what reverse osmosis is you pump raw sap, which is roughly 2% sugar, through a membrane that is semi-permeable, meaning the sugar molecules don't pass through, but pure water passes through at high pressure with a pump powered by electricity. So what happens is you concentrate the sugars on one side and the clean water comes out the other, and they're separated. So at the end of the day, you can create, instead of 3,000 gallons of 2% sap, you can create 300 gallons of 12% sap. And the efficiency for us is that you don't have to use a fossil fuel for hours and hours and hours. And we're talking, if we're trying to be environmentally conscious and not burn in fossil fuel, and we can boil that 300 gallons of concentrate in 4 hours instead of 10 hours boiling raw sap. So super efficient, and it does not affect, in my opinion, and this would be borne out by studies at UVM, that it doesn't affect the flavor of the syrup ultimately, but it's absolutely a game changer in terms of efficiency.
Wow, that was really good. I actually understood that, and science was not my strength. Talk about the fuel you use. This is a big change from the old days.
Yeah. So in the old days, when I was a kid, we used to fuel the evaporator with wood, and then in 1972 we moved to an oil-fired rig. Just a lot less time in the woods during the summer. You'd have to gather 20 or 30 cords of firewood during the summer in order to fuel the evaporator in the springtime. And everything, we didn't have reverse osmosis back then, right? So everything was done, I call it raw, but you're basically boiling 2% sap the entire time. We moved to an oil rig in 1972. And then in 2012, we went to a natural gas fired rig. So the cheese plant that used to be in Heinsberg, the gas company ran a line out to the cheese plant. About 3 months later, the cheese plant burned down. In that same year, I said, well, we're kind of due to upgrade our evaporator anyway. Why don't we move to a natural gas-fired rig? And I couldn't get any of the evaporator companies to even quote us on a natural gas rig. They'd never done one in New England. And I said, geez, it's just a burner. So I got a gentleman involved who does gas conversions all the time for different industrial plants, and he said, Steve, this is easy. I said, okay, great. Why don't you pick out the burner, and then I'm going to have the evaporator company design the evaporator around the burner, and that's what we did, and it's been fantastic. I don't have to worry about. I've got a lot of friends of mine that are in oil today, and obviously we have all these things going on all around the world, and the price of oil's gone through the roof right in the middle of sugaring season, right? And they're all worried about, well, geez, all of a sudden, oil is $1.50 more than it was a little while ago, and it doesn't sound like a lot to people, but if you've got to fill a 5,000-gallon tank, that's a significant expense. I don't have to worry about that with natural gas. I can tell you today what it's going to be next year. The gas company's buying futures, and I know exactly what I'm going to pay. It's very steady. It's much, much lower, in my opinion, than oil in most cases, right? We're probably 30 or 40% of what the cost of oil is. And it's super clean. You don't see any emissions. You don't see any. Not everybody has that luxury, right? You might live up in the mountains. You don't have a natural gas line. So I completely understand that luxury that we have versus everybody else. But it's, I think a lot of people are moving from wood, and they're doing it just because of time. They don't have all summer long to haul firewood. It's completely understandable. I wouldn't say it's easier, right? Sugaring is a ton of work, and I think that's what people miss in a lot of this, right? They don't understand. They come in and they say, geez, a price of a gallon of syrup is X. And you say, well, why don't you come out here and help me for the weekend? And when we get done the weekend, you let me know what you think we should charge for that gallon of syrup. And most of them say that should be $300 a gallon by the time they get done the weekend. So, yeah, it's a tremendous amount of work. But fuel's made a huge difference for us, and I think for everybody. And there's a huge shift in the industry, I think, in general. A lot of backyard sugar makers are still using wood. I think reverse osmosis has helped a lot. For those sugar makers that want to stay on wood, right? You don't have to have 30 cords of wood anymore, to produce 1,000 gallons of syrup. Now you can do that on 6 or 7 cords of wood just because of reverse osmosis, right? We need to boil a whole lot less than we ever used to. So the technology, again, it keeps getting back to technology, and every aspect of this revolves around technology, right? This burner, we're probably going to change that burner out that we have, the natural gas burner. They have much more efficient ones than they did even 12 or 13 years ago, right? So we could use a third less fuel just by swapping our burner out because technology's moved along so quickly.
Just so people know, we've sent Matt back out in the woods, or God only knows where. What difference has it made in terms of changing the grade of the syrup?
Yeah, there's been a huge shift in terms of consumer likes, I think, is probably a better, I think people have been educated now. Everybody used to say fancy which is the lightest syrup that we make, right, was the greatest thing because it was the hardest to make. It wasn't necessarily the best syrup. And I think people's tastes have changed, and they've realized over the years that, hey, wait a minute, there's all these other syrups out there, and I actually like something darker a lot better than I do a fancy because a fancy's got a very delicate flavor. And I always joke that this is a little bit like being a drug dealer, you know what I mean? People get hooked on syrup, and they usually start on a lighter grade, especially if they're used to something that's not real maple, let's put it that way. And once they start, if they go right to a dark, it's too much for them, right? And they'll start with a light and they'll say, okay, hey, this is really great. And after about a year living in Vermont, they'll go, okay, I think I'm ready for something a little heavier, and they'll move to a dark. And after 2 or 3 years, they're hooked on dark, and that's all that they want. So they try the other, they try a lighter, and they go, geez, I don't have any flavor. That's not really what I want. And I think that's happened, consistently. Like I said, when I was a kid, I think 80% of our syrup that we sold would be, to the public locally, would be light syrup. That's what they wanted. Now it's shifted on its head, and it's 80% dark. I think it's just that people have been educated about, the different grades of syrup and what they really taste like. So people come in here and they do samplings all the time, right? We do thousands of samplings, and I'll start out with a light syrup and medium and a dark. And it's really interesting. Folks from out of state will generally walk out of here with a light or a medium, and folks locally, almost all of them will walk out of here with a dark, right? They're used to real maple at home. They're used to this on their table, and they know what they're getting. They know what they want. And I think people walk into the store now, too. It used to be people would walk into a grocery store, and they'd say, I need maple syrup, and they just grab whatever's on the shelf. Now people are much more conscious about what they're buying. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, what grade is this? Is this really what I want? Are my kids going to be disappointed when I bring this home? So, there's been quite an education, I think, with folks in understanding that maple syrup isn't maple syrup. There's 4 different grades, and what you really like is personal taste, and you need to pick and choose the one that you really like.
One of the things, I was here last weekend and I was talking with Tom, and I felt naive that I didn't already know this, but I didn't, that when you go to some outlets to buy, as opposed to coming to an actual sugar house like here, you're not necessarily buying syrup from one farm.
Correct. Yeah, and I think locally that may not be as true as it is if you get outside of Vermont, certainly outside of New England. This industry, what's happened, we've grown as an industry from these small little cottage operations where folks had 1,000 or 2,000 taps and everybody went to their local sugar maker and they bought syrup direct from their local sugar maker. Now we have middlemen that come in, and because people have, technology's allowed us to do this at massive scale. I've got a friend of mine up north that has 50,000 taps, and you think about that at scale and you say, geez, these guys are going to produce, say, 20,000 gallons or 25,000 gallons of syrup this year. You're not going to sell that. If you're in Franklin County, you're not going to sell 25,000 gallons of syrup out your front door to your neighbors. That's just not going to happen. So they're selling that in drums generally to a middleman who's buying that and selling it to Whole Foods and all of these other folks. Well, what happens, they'll put that syrup in a giant silo, let's say, and heat it, and they'll mix 25 sugar makers syrup together, and most of that will be great blue ribbon syrup, and you'll have some of it that probably isn't as good, and what comes out of the other end generally is mediocre, right? It's not, you lose the individuality of the product. And I have been a huge advocate with the association about this. I'm a big fan of bigger operations. I understand what these guys are trying to do is help the industry tremendously, but we need to look out for the quality, right? And that's really a huge concern of mine. When you go to a local sugar maker, they're not going to sell you something that they wouldn't put on their own table, right? If you buy from, let's say, Whole Foods, you have no idea who made that product because their name's not on that container anymore. It's mixed with 25 other sugar makers. And I'm not downgrading anybody's syrup. I think it's, most of it is phenomenal blue ribbon syrup, especially most of what comes out of Vermont. But people tell me all the time when they do tastings, they go, I buy syrup from, XYZ store and it doesn't taste like this. And I'm like, that's because you've lost the individuality of that product, right? So if you don't look at a container on a store shelf and it doesn't have a sugar maker's name and address on there, you're probably not buying from an individual sugar maker. You're buying from a conglomerate that's mixed it all together. And it's unfortunate to some degree, but I understand what's happened. We've become a big industry, and it's a great thing for Vermont that we've done this. I mean, it's allowed all these farms to stay open and available, right? Dairy is gone today for the most part in Vermont. Maple is the only thing that seems to be continually growing and expanding in terms of ag here.
How much of your syrup do you farm out?
We sell to the public 100% of what we produce. So we'll usually run out of syrup somewhere in the fall.
When you say that the industry has grown, do you have any sense, I mentioned before, it's 3 million gallons come out of Vermont. Do you have any idea what it was 10, 20 years ago?
It's half that. Yeah, and technology's helped us a lot too, but the number of taps here in Vermont's grown dramatically, and I see this continuing as technology continues to evolve. And people are able to, produce more syrup, and the value of the product is continuing to go up. Right, demand increases overall globally about 5% a year for pure maple, and the prices are finally starting to come up. They didn't come up for years and years and years, and now I think people have realized, hey, there's a lot of work in this. There's a lot of energy, a lot of cost in this, and consumers don't seem to mind. I mean, if they want to support their local sugar maker, they want to support their local farmers. So it's great. People come in. People don't ask me, gee, Steve, the price of syrup on the shelf here is XYZ. I can get it down the road for $3 less. They don't do that, right? They're coming in and they want to know the person, want to shake the person's hand that produced it. They want to understand where it came from. They want to know all about their food. And that's what their biggest concern is. And the fact that the price went up $2 from last year, I don't think, at least people don't tell me that today, that's a concern for them. And I don't see it in terms of sales. Any issue at all. All of our costs are going up every year, right? The price of fuel is going up every single year. The price of electricity is going up every year. The price of containers is going up every year. The price of all of the products we got to buy for the woods is going up every single year, and I think people understand that.
What's a gallon going to cost today?
We are at $55 a gallon today, and it was funny. I was talking with a sugar maker the other day, and I said, this should be $200 a gallon. The amount of work we put into this in hours. We don't count our time in all of this. And that's, if you had to pay yourself at the end of the day, I'm not sure you'd be paying yourself $1 an hour when it was all done. And most people wouldn't work for those kind of wages, right? Even at large scale. I mean, it's pretty interesting. I was up in Starksboro yesterday talking with some folks that have 42,000 taps. And they get to the end of the season like this, and if it's a down year, right, they may not even cover their costs. So the price is going to go up. And, the price of everything. I mean, you go to the grocery store today, right? I walk out with 2 bags of groceries, and I can't get out of there for less than $100, no matter what. And I'm not buying expensive things, right? These are just store shelf items. I think people expect that's got to happen. And if we want the industry to grow, we have to be able to stay up with the cost increases. So, yeah, I would say things are going to slowly drift up. If we have a down year this year, and I don't know that we are yet, ask me in May, I would imagine the price, per gallon is going to go up to cover that. If folks only produce 75% of a crop, somehow they still have to cover their costs. So
how do you determine what the price is going to be? Is it based on what last year was, or? something else?
No, I usually, and I don't pay attention to what anybody else is doing. We kind of set our own prices and say, okay, this is what we think is a fair price. And if, it's hard sometimes because a lot of times you don't know what things cost you until after the season's over with. I might buy $10,000 worth of containers right this year. I don't know really what the price of that's going to be. I'll go in and we'll buy a ton of containers. I don't get the bill for that for 30 days. So you're like, okay, prices went up 10% on containers. That results in X. We usually produce this much syrup. That's going to mean it's an increase of 50 cents a gallon or whatever the price may be. And that's kind of how we look at things. We kind of pull everything together and we say, okay, the price of fuel went up this much. The price of tubing went up this much. We invested, $10,000 in new tubing and new equipment and yada, yada, yada. How do we price that in? Right? It ends up being $1 or $2 a gallon at the end of the day. Okay, well, then that's what we need to raise our price to cover the cost.
When you say it's a really difficult job, which you've mentioned a couple of times, and I know you love it too, but educate me. What's difficult about this job?
It's a lot of hours, right? And people will tell you that tubing is a lot less work than an old-fashioned bucket operation. I'm going to tell you that's not true. It's just that you get to spread that work out over the course of the year, right? So we'll be in the woods working in the summer and fall. It's really about time and hours. I'm a civil engineer by trade. Trust me, I can make a lot more per hour working as a civil engineer than I can producing syrup, but I have a lot more fun doing this. This is so enjoyable. I get to meet tons of people. The greatest people, and everybody comes into the sugar house and has fun. Nobody comes in disappointed or leaves disappointed, and that's one of our rules here, right? We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about anything that might depress or upset anybody. That's not what this is about. This is about a Vermont experience and coming in and really enjoying yourself and learning about maple and how it's produced and technology. And people usually walk away from here and their jaws are hitting the ground like, I had no idea all of this technology, was involved in producing a gallon of maple. I have no idea, right? And it's amazing. I can show them my iPhone and I go, okay, I can control all of this equipment today from my iPhone. And they're like, you're kidding me, right? Where's the horses and the buckets?
Yeah, that's mind-boggling. It would probably be really good, though, to try to educate the future. And, why don't you bring school kids in here?
Yeah, we did. We just did a school tour.
I'm joking.
Yeah, we just did a school tour yesterday, and it's fun to watch these kids. Their minds open right up. My sister's a just barely retired school teacher, and she gets right down to their level, and she brings them outside, and she's got all these great analogies to explain to them, why sap runs out of a tree, and she lets them try the sap, and then we bring them inside, and we have a sap run where we talk about how many gallons of sap does it make to produce a gallon of syrup, and then we have a big sap run where they take a bucket and we split the class in half, right, and they do a race with 40 gallons of, they hand it off to the next person. We do 40 laps, right, after we've got them all sugared up, and they're running around, and it's about learning the concepts, and of course at the end I always tell them, now how old's the sugar maker? He's 40 years old too, right? So it takes, a tree 40 years to grow before you can tap it. It takes 40 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup, and the sugar maker's 40 years old. So
always 40.
Always, yeah. I've been 40. I've got a little bit of experience with that age.
Are you still worried about the future, though?
No, I don't think that climate change is going to be catastrophic to us. It may shift a little bit our window of when we sugar. I don't see Vermont, at least in my lifetime, or maybe even the next generation, being at a point where it's 60 degrees here in the winter and springtime. I don't think that's going to happen. We've had, I would say, a 10 or 12 degree temperature shift over the course of my lifetime. And a lot of it, it's amazing. I mean, you're old enough, too, to remember being a kid, or younger anyway, when, we'd have snow here that was 3 feet deep most of the winter. This was a winter, I call this an old-fashioned Vermont winter, and that's what this reminded me of being a kid, where we had lots of cold and lots of snow. Is it cyclical? I don't know. What helped us a lot in terms of temperature this year was the lake freezing over. That hasn't happened in about 5 years, right? So we're down in the valley here, and when the lake freezes over, it keeps the whole valley cooler, right? We're about 3-4, I'm not a meteorologist, but I'm going to tell you it's 3 or 4 or 5 degrees cooler here when the lake completely freezes over in the winter and spring than if it doesn't. So that kind of prolongs the season a little bit. And that's what's happened to us, I think, a lot this year. We had a lot of days that were 30, 32 degrees in, late February, where if the lake hadn't frozen over, we would probably be in the mid-30s, and we would have probably gotten some pretty good sap runs. And we didn't get that. So it's kind of interesting. But that helps you later on in the season, too, right? You get into early April when things warm up and you're like, okay, I need that freeze at night. It's been a couple of days. We need that freeze-thaw cycle to drive the sap flows. And a lot of times you'll get those freezes at night where you wouldn't otherwise if the lake wasn't frozen over.
How much longer do you think this season's going to go?
Well, I'm not a meteorologist, but if you believe the meteorologist, which I only do about 25% of the time, the last freeze we're going to get here in the valley is Tuesday or Wednesday night, I think. And that means by the following weekend, we'll probably be done collecting sap, right? We're only going to get 2 or 3 days of a run after each freeze cycle. And when that stops, and that's primarily, people don't understand this, that's primarily why syrup is produced in northern New England rather than the rest of the country. Every place has maple trees, right? But you don't have that weather that's necessarily conducive. It's the freeze-thaw cycle that drives the sap flow. So if you don't have that, you don't produce any sap. You can go down to West Virginia, right? They've got maple trees all over the place, but they don't produce any sap unless you're at high elevation because they just don't have the weather that we have here.
What would this season look like historically for you?
Historically, we are typically done by the 6th, 7th, 8th of April anyway because the buds start to come out of the trees, right? I wouldn't say ending at the 3rd or 4th of April is catastrophic by any means, right? We're pretty well on track. We've had some great runs over the last 2 weeks. We'll see what happens. Vermont as a state can produce the majority of their syrup in 10 days as long as we get the weather that's conducive to that. I see that coming for the upper elevations over this next week. Right. Like I said, I was up in Starksboro yesterday just talking with a bunch of different sugar makers, and people have had a really good couple of days, and all we need is another week or 10 days of that, and we'll have a pretty good season. If we get another 3 boils, 4 boils, we'll be in pretty good shape.
That would take you up to high 80s, 90?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a catastrophic year for us at that point, right? So I always say, okay, and if we get to the 80% mark, we've covered all our costs. If we get above that, then we can do all these cool things that we want to do next year and afford to, add more technology and more equipment. We don't usually pay ourselves here at this scale. We take that and we put it into cool new things we want to do around the sugar house.
Wow. So you say you have to get to 80% of what you expect in order to cover your costs. I mean, that's an interesting business model, Steve.
Right. Yeah, well, like I said, this is more of a hobby than it is that's why I'm a civil engineer, right? I have to earn a living over here. This is what I do for fun.
Are your kids going to take over?
That's a great question. My girls are 12, and they're very much girly girls. They're into, friends and makeup and dance and all those kind of things. So I don't think I knew either when I was 12 really what I was going to be or what I was going to do. They love, being the quality control team, I can tell you that, and trying all the different products that we make. So I'm hopeful, that one of them will be interested in this. But who knows? This is a labor of love, and if you don't love it and you don't really fall in love with it, you're not going to probably do this for, put in thousands of hours a year just because you enjoy it.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, brought to you by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks to Steve Palmer, and thank you for listening.